Today, it's almost impossible to think about how disconnected the world used to be. At the beginning of the new Shogun TV series that's based on James Clavell's best-selling 1975 novel of the same name, the first recorded Europeans to visit Japan had only arrived there a little more than half a century earlier. By the time the story begins in the year 1600, Portuguese Jesuits enjoyed a trade monopoly that had been making them rich. The story is loosely based on historical characters and events that reflect what was happening in the region at that time. But when discussing episodes, I'll be sticking to the show's version of events so it doesn't get too confusing. According to that, the Portuguese Catholics were essentially able to keep the route to Japan a secret until the Dutch ship the Erasmus limps its way to shore at the beginning of the first episode. In the brief time we spend on the ship, we get an understanding of how disastrous and costly the voyage was. They started out with 5 ships and a crew of over 500 men, and are now barely a single vessel with about a dozen, and those remaining are on the brink of starvation. The captain has made the decision that he's going to end his own life, and asks his pilot, John Blackthorne, for his gun. And before he gives it to him, he argues that he's taking the coward's way out. There are many interesting contrasts in this episode, and his reaction to the captain is something we'll come back to when the idea of suicide comes up again. Blackthorne, who is an outsider as the only Englishman on a crew made up of Dutch Protestants, manages to hold out until the Erasmus is found drifting off the coast of the fictional fishing village called Ajiro, which is under the control of an ambitious young samurai named Omi. He sees an opportunity to make an impression and calls on his uncle Yabashige, who is the local lord. Blackthorne and the remaining crew start their journey as prisoners, and the rotting fish guts and piss on the back of the head are probably not the kind of welcome they were hoping for. The good news is that they're no longer starving to death. The bad news is that the local priest sees them as a threat and wants them executed. This gives Yabushige a chance to practice a sadistic ritual that he seems to enjoy quite a bit, boiling one of the crew alive in a giant cauldron that they would normally use for rendering whale blubber. What the crew of the Erasmus doesn't know is that Japan is on the brink of a civil war, and we get a sense of that when one of our other main characters, Toranaga, is taken prisoner under much different circumstances. The last ruler, and this gets complicated because Japan has an emperor at this time, who's technically above everyone else in the hierarchy, but served more as the cultural leader, with political power being wielded by warlords, who still needed endorsement from the emperor to rise to the top. But the last one of those, the Taiko, has died, and his heir is too young to replace him. Before his death, the Taiko created a council of regents made up of the greatest warlords to maintain peace until his son came of age. Toranaga had been summoned to Osaka and confined to his quarters because the other regents were concerned about the moves he was making to consolidate his power, and the way he was expanding his fiefdom. Lord Ishido, who rules Osaka, is his primary rival, and he's allied with the other 3 regents who have accused Toranaga of keeping the heir's mother, Ochiba, hostage in his castle, and for that they're now threatening to impeach him. One of the things I really liked about the first episode is that it doesn't hold your hand going out of its way to explain every single detail through the things the characters say to each other. A lot is happening, but it's also a fluid situation because none of these men hold direct power over the others. It's complicated and breeds treachery, and the slight disorientation is a good way to emphasize this. But by the end of the second episode, where it sort of switches gears and turns into the exposition, the political situation is mostly laid out and boils down to this. To the other regents, Toranaga's actions look like those of a man who is trying to become the next shogun, or military dictator to rule the entire country. In practice, this was a hereditary position that could only be appointed by the emperor. This meant that men like the Taiko and Ishido, who came from peasant families, could never be granted the title, but someone like Toranaga could because of his lineage. That distinction adds a layer of distrust between the different regions. Of course, he claims that he doesn't want to be the shogun, but he'd also have to say that because any claims to that effect would be treasonous and would bolster the other regions as grounds for impeachment. And just to be clear, impeachment would involve death. The other regions who sided with Ishido also converted to Catholicism because they benefited from the riches and guns their trade with the Jesuits provided for them. The Portuguese Catholics' incredibly lucrative trade monopoly is possible in part because they're able to act as a middleman between China and Japan in this period, and they benefit from Japan's relative isolation from other places. Because of this and the ongoing religious wars in Europe, Protestants like Blackthorne are a real threat to their interests in the region. The Dutch fleet that included the Erasmus acquired a Spaniard's navigation guide called a rudder, and they used that to navigate to Japan, plundering Catholic bases along the way. So there are a lot of moving parts, and while the council is making its claims against Toranaga, one of his vassals gets out of line by forcefully objecting to his treatment. In doing that, he steps into the ceremonial meeting hall, which is forbidden, and draws his sword, which you might imagine is also forbidden. This might seem like a minor infraction, an understandable outburst given the situation, but given the cultural context, it's anything but. To de-escalate the situation and protect his lord, Todayashi offers to commit seppuku, or ritual suicide, while also offering to end his family line by sacrificing his infant son. When I first read the book Shogun decades ago, of all the foreign things I experienced for the first time in it, seppuku was the hardest thing to wrap my head around. Intellectually, I could understand ending your life on your own terms or restoring your honor after you brought shame on yourself or your master. But it seemed like this came up so often as a solution to things that it just blew my mind. One thing I think is important to note about Todayashi's situation is that he offers to do this himself, rather than Toranaga commanding him to do so. Also, the samurai are members of a trained warrior class. People who can use violence to maintain order with a license to kill, as we see when the samurai kills the Christian villager who refuses to stop praying when Blackthorne is being taken to Yabu. This is the way the ruling class keeps them in check, so even though Toranaga doesn't command Tobayashi, the situation does highlight that dynamic. And as I've already mentioned, when Blackthorne is questioned by Yabu, his encounter with the Portuguese priest lays out the tension between them that Toranaga is banking on using to his advantage. I appreciated Hiramatsu's response when he told him he was sending him to check on the ship. It seems like a diversion from the very real threat to their lives in Osaka, but as is usually the case, Toranaga is a few steps ahead of everyone else. Yabashika was looking at the Erasmus as an opportunity to better his situation with things looking dire for his lord. He's completely caught off guard when Hiramatsu shows up to confiscate the ship and order him to travel to Osaka with Blackthorne in tow. He's left with no choice but to offer the ship and its cargo up to Toranaga and act as though that was always the plan, even if no one really believes that's what was happening. Back at the castle, we see Toranaga interact with the heir and the Taiko's widow, and when we see Todayashi's wife react to the news that she has to give up her son for sacrifice, we meet the final major character, Mariko. She intervenes when Fuji threatens to take her own life, and Mariko's skill in handling the situation gives a sense of why Toranaga calls on her later when he needs a translator he can trust. This is a big surprise to her because she's just married to one of his top-ranking men. She hasn't interacted with Toranaga directly all that much. We find out she learned to speak Portuguese from her priest when she turned to Catholicism, and she did that after a tragedy involving her father tore her world apart, which we don't know all the details of that yet. I should mention that when we hear the characters speaking English in the show, most of the time they're actually speaking Portuguese to each other, and the show is just avoiding subtitling those parts, which seems like a pretty good decision. Mariko is married to a vassal named Buntaro, and they have a teenage son together. Overall, they don't appear to like each other very much, but they both still fulfill their duties as husband and wife. She is a samurai, and that means she would have been trained to fight with the Naginata spear while she was growing up. She appears to be very loyal to her lord, so there are many reasons why she's the perfect choice for this role. But the one concern Toranaga has is that as a Protestant, Blackthorne is an enemy of her faith. He wants to know if her loyalty to God would conflict with her service to him. And she admits that it would if she were only a Christian, but says that she has more than one heart, which I think is a statement that encapsulates much of what we've been seeing in the first hour. And not just from her, from all of the characters. He responds that he thinks that fate brought them together. Toranaga, Mariko, and the barbarian, Blackthorne, who he thinks might be able to turn the tide. On his trip to Osaka, he has the opportunity to make himself useful to the Japanese when they encounter a storm that he helps them navigate. It had carried away the ship's Spanish pilot, Rodriguez, who had been given the task to make sure that Blackthorne made it to Osaka. That presents an opportunity for Blackthorne to show a side that's a little more noble than the one who kept the journal of exploits against the Spanish on his way there to get rich. He refuses to leave Rodriguez behind even though they're on opposite sides when it comes down to it. And that leads to him challenging Yabashige, who falls trying to scale the cliff face and nearly dies trying to save the Spaniard. This scene is like a microcosm of his experience through this land full of what he describes as godless savages. And it involves the character who boiled someone alive because he's obsessed with the moment of death and the way men face it. And a character who still manages to be the most charismatic on screen, even though you know he does that kind of thing. It's fascinating to see how Blackthorne experiences this encounter. Yabu's choice to stop fighting, pull his sword, and end his life on his own terms is essentially the same thing the captain did on the Erasmus. But instead of seeing this as the coward's way out, we see him bow out of respect when Yabu makes it back alive. Whether this is about the man, the way of life, or the samurai's relationship with death is open for interpretation at this point, but the encounter clearly marks a point in the character's development. And honestly, raving in Portuguese when no one can really understand you anyway would only get you so far. We saw how losing your cool certainly didn't work out for Todayashi and his son, whose end we see before Blackthorne is brought in front of Mariko and Toranaga. On the way there, he found out that Rodriguez discovered the Spanish rudder and his personal journal with evidence of their piracy. When confronted, he declares he will not die in this wretched land. Rodriguez laughs at that, saying, "Tell me when you set eyes on Osaka if you really think our world is the hilt of civilization. And then ask yourself, what kind of man wields power in a land like this? The one who schemes in the open, or the one you never see?" This connects back to what Toranaga said about the falcon in his opening scene, which I haven't mentioned yet, where he says the bird conceals herself against the sun, conserving energy, waiting for her moment. You might never know she's there. As he's talking, we see how impressive Osaka is, and the range of Toranaga's influence from Todayashi's suicide to the spy that was sending him information about Yabu. Rodriguez carries on with the idea of a man having more than one heart, and then completes the circle when he suggests that maybe fate has brought Blackthorne there for a reason, and maybe he'll live long enough to find out what it is. As he's saying that, we see the Anjin, the Japanese word for pilot, which is also the name of the episode. We see the Anjin brought before Lord Toranaga, and the episode comes to an end as the Englishman bows to him. I traveled to Japan for the first time last year, and when I was looking at places to visit, the Osaka castle jumped off the screen at me. I was thinking, why does that sound so familiar? And I realized that years ago I read about it in that giant paperback that always used to catch my eye as I passed my father's bookshelf when I was a kid. It had the katana's hilt on the cover, it looked cool, and at that time I really didn't know much of anything about modern day Japan, let alone its feudal roots. It just wasn't something I encountered in popular culture at that time. It was a faraway place that felt that way. The book was absolutely massive compared to everything else on the shelf though, and that left enough of an impression that I eventually read it when I was a teenager. The introduction to the period and Japanese culture at that time was fascinating, but the hook of the story was the way I experienced the characters, and how it differed from other stranger in a strange land stories I read before it. You have both sides referring to each other as savages and barbarians, and in those types of books, the point of view is usually clear as to who the author thinks the actual savages are, and what they need to be saved from themselves. But by the end of Shogun, you could see the case that each side was making about the other, and that seemed really novel to me at the time. There's a balance of beauty and barbarism coexisting, while everyone schemes for power and to advance their cause. The show arrives in a much different time, but the complicated characters provide a lot of potential for something that feels of this moment. And I think it's still a story that has some surprises that will be a lot of fun to watch play out. This was a beautiful looking pilot episode that hit on a lot of what I liked about reading the book a long time ago. As far as changes, I think most of what I noticed made sense, particularly centering on Toranaga right away and giving more attention to the Japanese point of view. They did spend a lot less time with the crew of the Erasmus, which seems okay since I think they got the same points about their intentions and expectations across. Of course, they cut a lot of other stuff out, but it seemed like a fair interpretation. And the world that they built looked fantastic. The cast and performances all were landing for me, and it seems like a very promising start in a situation where they have to introduce a lot of information at the beginning of this thing to get it going. So I'm looking forward to see where it goes next, and I think that is a great place to leave things. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.